I think we'll make a start now. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to this panel debate session on shifting the transport sector to a whole life carbon approach. My name's Stephen Allen. I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath, and I have a background in life cycle assessment and within that whole life carbon across built environment, at the energy sector, and in a couple of other applications. My background's partly in academia and partly working in industry and also in the Houses of Parliament as a scientific advisor in this sort of area. So welcome to the session. Earlier this year, an update to the 2013 Infrastructure Carbon Review was published. It found that while emissions from other infrastructure sectors have reduced, those from the transport sector have increased, both in terms of operational carbon and capital or embodied carbon. Transport's now the single biggest carbon emitting infrastructure sector, said the report. Meanwhile, climate science has become ever more compelling. We must reach net zero emissions by 2050 to have a good chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. More and more governments and companies are adopting net zero targets. Achieving net zero demands a whole life carbon perspective. It means net zero across embodied or capital carbon, operational carbon, and in the context of infrastructure, user carbon. To explore this issue across a range of different transport sectors, I'm delighted to introduce you to our panel. So we have 4 panelists today. Dr. Kim Yates is the UK and Europe Sustainability and Climate Change Lead at Mott MacDonald, and their motor carbon portal product lead, which can be used to calculate and reduce embodied carbon in new built assets. Kim has extensive experience in the transport sector and over 20 years of experience of sustainability, best practice, climate change, and carbon issues. So Kim, could you make your 5-minute opening remarks, please?
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Stephen. Basically, I'm pretty old and I've been working in this space a very, very long time, particularly in the transport sector. But again, going back to what Stephen said was, we're now in a net zero world and the transport sector has a massive part to play. But actually in a net zero world, it's quite a complicated world. And traditionally, if we've done any form of carbon footprinting or anything as we've moved along, we've looked at everything in its own particular silos, own particular projects. But what we're seeing now is that the UK wants to be net zero by 2050. It's very, very important. So looking at everything in its own silos is now not good enough. We now need to be looking at the whole system. So when we're talking about net zero, again, we're thinking about systems thinking in terms of we're not just looking at construction, we are looking at how we can influence the users, how we can influence, for example, road users in highway schemes, what we can do to help the I suppose national highways, for example, what they can do to look at their own organisation, what they can do in terms of their construction programmes, what they can do in terms of how they nudge, is probably the easiest way, road users to become low carbon in this net zero world. So that is a very, very sort of high level helicopter view of it. But what you're finding again in this net zero world is not just when we're looking at construction, road users, train users or whatever, is that you only have so much control. So that again is why it's so important to look at the whole life of something and not just what you can influence, what you have direct control over, but also what you can influence. So when we're looking at net zero, we're looking at energy primarily, and how we obtain that energy. I suppose taking a step back, this week is the first time that the UK has actually literally fired up a coal-powered electricity station. And with that, it's the first time But if you think about it, as we're moving to more electric vehicles, I think Chris will be talking about electric plants, etc., on construction sites, is that demand for green energy, not clean energy, is going to increase and increase and increase. And this, taking a step back, is really important, that if you excuse the pun, that in the transport sector, we're not just looking at what we've got in our own little projects, it's what we're looking at in the wider world. So when we're designing for EVs, etc., where is this energy going to come from? Is it actually going to be green energy? Okay, so I've gone a little bit esoteric here. So the key things to think about are systems of systems. Now, the exam question is shifting transport to a whole life cycle approach to carbon footprinting. And again, it's imperative that we do this. Again, we're always thinking short-termism, but we've got to be net zero by 2050. So we are looking at the whole life of anything that we do. And this includes, again, if we take a step back into the construction side of things, this includes not just what we're putting in the ground, it's looking at it in terms of replacement cycles, its lifetime cycles, etc. So I'm going to give you an example of concrete roads. So if you look at concrete roads, you think, lovely, marvellous, doesn't sound too good if you just look at the concrete that's going in at the first place. But because they are more hard wearing, they actually have a lower carbon footprint overall if you're looking across the 50 years to 2050. But you invest that carbon in there right at the beginning and then carry on. But of course, with new materials that are coming online at the moment, concrete, again, everybody thinks, not so great. There are new materials coming to the forefront that actually pull out carbon out of the atmosphere. So again, it's thinking in this new way, not the short-termism, it's that looking at the whole life carbon. I'm just thinking, Stephen, how much time have I got? Can't hear you. Okay. I'm sure you'll interrupt me as I'm carrying on. So,
oh, sorry, I was still muted. I was saying you're bang on. That's 5 minutes. Thank you, Kim. But so I was still muted.
I've set the whole the scene for you in terms of thinking big, thinking systems,
absolutely.
Thinking about not just that little widget that you're looking at, and hopefully set it up well for my colleagues who will be speaking next.
Thank you very much. I also should say to everyone, I missed the housekeeping. Everybody's done it, but please keep your mics muted if you're not speaking. The most important thing, though, for all the attendees is please use the chat to ask questions. So by all means, during these opening remarks, you can be asking questions if something comes to mind, and we will then pick them up in the Q&A. So please feel free to be putting questions into the chat, and I'll ask them later when we get to the Q&A. So thank you very much, Kim. Next, we have Chris Hayes, who is Sustainability Operations Director at Skanska. He leads Skanska's specialist team of environmental and community engagement experts in one of the world's leading construction groups, who have expertise in major infrastructure, construction, commercial and residential development. As a chartered environmentalist, Chris has worked in the industry for over 25 years, including voluntary public and private sector roles in a number of different technical and strategic sustainability disciplines. So Chris, we welcome your 5-minute opening remarks.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you, Kim, for teaming up so well. So it's clear that there must be a step change in carbon emission reductions across all sectors. The UK economy, and in particular the industries which support the delivery of infrastructure and transport infrastructure, just aren't yet decarbonised. And when delivering on the government's Build Back Better or Build agenda, there's a risk that the UK's climate objectives are diminished just as a result of the sheer scale and pace of that anticipated investment in infrastructure delivery. The scope 3, the supply chain carbon, as part of that whole carbon scenario that Kim was talking about, is pretty small from an asset owner or operator perspective. It's 90% of my carbon, of a principal contractor carbon. That embodied carbon is over 90% of what I report in scope 3. So for my business, it's a huge amount that we need to go out, and it's primarily in cement, steel and That probably makes up 70% of my total carbon, just in those three things. We made significant gains on the fuel side through the adoption of alternative fuels and technologies. Kim talked about battery and hydrogen starting to feature in places that are difficult to connect to the grid, and then you question where that hydrogen is coming from, how it's manufactured. Just complicates things to people on site that just want to get on and build stuff. We're only seeing incremental changes in cement and steel now, so it still features really highly in my business's carbon report. We've got robust plans in place based on 10 years of data, as you'd expect. 6 focus areas to help with decarbonise those areas around how we use data and the tools to drive that data, collaborating with the supply chain, focusing on materials and the plant and equipment side, and also the skills that we need to encourage those changes and collaborate with the supply chain. So our 50% reduction in intensity in absolute carbon target by 2030 and the net zero by 2045 without offsetting, although don't sound too good these days when you look at the other announcements, they're not based on optimistic innovation or fairy dust or powdered unicorn horns, but on where we thought the market would be in 2019. And as we progress and as the industry improves, we're now looking at that again. We think we can probably get there earlier in some sectors, such as transport, without over-reliance on offsetting, which seems to be the default option right now in many organisations. Before we entertain offsetting, there's so much more that we can do within current standards and with emerging solutions. And people will always blame the standard, especially when we look at things like cement and concrete, that the code doesn't allow this and the code doesn't allow that. And actually, as an industry, we can be so much more efficient and we can stretch the parameters of those standards if we collaborate and work better through that whole project cycle. And in fact, as Kim alluded to, it might actually make sense to invest capital carbon to realise a longer term whole life reduction. It might not help my targets for a contractor, but it's the right thing to do. This year, DfT launched the decarbonisation plan. It was great to see some quantifiable carbon reductions as a requirement in procurement now, and we're starting to see those come through in the construction playbook and in the procurement note of 621. And these scope 3 emissions are really critical. The capital infrastructure is part of that whole net zero target and there has to be good collaborations. We see that already. I think Jamie's going to talk from the Network Rail perspective, but National Highways Network Rail is starting to push the supply chain together on science-based targets initiatives, which will start to get traction. Customers are now starting to ask for these things. So that removes the risk of early movement cost, although we saw that as an opportunity, not a risk. And it allowed us to invest in things like our EV first policy last year, the full use of HBO fuel, can't get electricity first on site. We're now starting to see commercial gains from those early mover advantages in those markets. However, if we're really going to get there in the short to medium term from a scope 3 perspective, institutional level investment in material manufacturing of cement and steel to accelerate these pathways is required. They're parts from government or government backed, but everybody in this space, myself, my competitors, my customers, all rely on and buy the same materials. And at the moment, we're seeing good movement in Europe, in Sweden, with zero carbon steel and carbon capture storage in cement manufacturing, but not in the UK. So right now, European products are looking a bit better, but the industry just isn't there in the manufacturing side to help me reduce my scope 3 emissions and help reduce the whole life carbon. And I'll finish that, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Chris. Perfect. Bang on time as well. Thank you very much. Okay, so next up in our panel, we have Jamie Shaw. And Jamie is Low Emission Strategy Lead at Network Rail. He oversees key carbon management aspects of Network Rail's decarbonisation programme, engaging with the value chain and ensuring consistent application of carbon data across the business, which is a crucial area I'm sure will come out in discussion. Jamie has over 20 years experience in sustainability, previously working as a product sustainability manager at Jaguar Land Rover. So over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. I know what you're probably thinking. I don't look old enough to have been working in the profession for 20 years. But yeah, I've got a fairly unusual background, I guess, when it comes to sustainability, having worked in the fields of guided weapons, Formula One, the premium luxury automotive space with Jaguar Land Rover, and now with Network Rail as a low emission transport provider. I guess one thing that I've picked up in my my career, and we'll probably touch on during the course of the discussion, is the importance of understanding the kind of big picture, and certainly from a carbon perspective, looking at whole life carbon, and where the kind of hotspots occur, whether it's a product, a service, an infrastructure company that you're kind of running. The key for me, I guess, and I get slightly frustrated with the kind of profession, I guess, in some regards, a lot of focus at the moment on decarbonisation, which is great. In my 20 years, we've never had this kind of level of focus and attention on what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what we need to achieve. But we've got to be careful that we don't pin all of our hopes on kind of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and your direct kind of fuel consumption and electricity consumption. Clearly, we need to get those from clean, green and renewable sources. But what we've picked up with the work at Network Rail in covering our carbon emissions is that actually those two, our kind of fuel use and our electricity use, actually only account for 3% of our carbon footprint. So clearly, even if I'm successful in eliminating all of those carbon emissions through my role, I've barely scratched the surface in terms of the impact that we have as an organisation. So it's absolutely fundamental that we engage the supply chain, that we work with those key suppliers, but on every project that we have running as an organisation, carbon becomes a key element of that particular project. So we need to get insight and better insight into the materials that we're using. Why are we using them? Are they the best option from a carbon perspective? And we can set those kind of requirements and targets at a project level, or as a business we can set those targets, but clearly, as Chris has alluded to, we need to work with the kind of value chain to start driving down those emissions, whether it be suppliers getting their own energy from low carbon renewable sources, whether it be reusing materials intelligently rather than digging stuff out of the ground and creating kind of new virgin material that in general tends to be higher in terms of carbon impact. How can we intelligently reuse material? I used to think when I was at Jaguar Land Rover, I'm sure there's enough aluminium on the planet that's already been created from bauxite that we could be using more intelligently. And we managed to create a closed loop system where over time we were moving from 25% up to 75% kind of closed loop or recycled aluminium in the body structures. And if you can do it in a vehicle, I'm pretty sure you can do it with any kind of use of metal. So that's the kind of challenge that we have in addressing the carbon challenge. But for me, the key is that this isn't just about getting energy from renewable sources and cutting down our kind of fuel consumption. This is about thinking big picture, where are the impacts occurring, and applying kind of carbon critical thinking across every element of a project's life cycle. Hopefully that's a little bit of insight from my perspective at Network Rail.
Great. Yes, thank you very much, Jamie. That's yeah, great. It's all sort of fitting together nicely to tee up the question and answer session. So thank you very much. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kadambari Lokesh, who is Decarbonate Research Fellow at the Institute for Transport Studies. She has a PhD in aerospace from Cranfield University with multidisciplinary work focusing on techno-economic environmental risk analysis of advanced biofuels in civil aero engines. Before joining the University of Leeds, Kadam worked at the University of York, leading the development of an environmental framework for assessing industrial polymers. So over to you, Kadam.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, and in stark contrast to the experience, the gathered experience of the rest of the team, I have to try a bit harder here, I believe. So I'd like to share a screen, if that's okay. Is that visible? Sorry. Cool.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you again for the introduction, Stephen and Danny, for the invitation. Hello, everyone. I'm Lokesh from the Institute for Transport Studies. My interest lies in low carbon innovation and their sustainability, for which I employ life cycle assessment. Therefore, I'm keen about infrastructure, more particularly embodied carbon. I couldn't possibly stress the importance of decarbonizing transport any more than what you may have heard in the last few days and before. Diving straight into the issue, every transport decarbonization white paper that addresses road and rail seems to put all its eggs into two placebo baskets, and yes, that's what they are, electrification and hydrogen infrastructure. The reality is that there is simply not enough lithium or cobalt in the world to churn out 32 million cars, buses and trains every 20 or 50 years. Paula's striking plenary on Monday afternoon described the upstream humanitarian and ecological crises the electrification has on her country's lithium-rich landscapes. And there is little to no question about what will happen to the 30 million EV batteries that will retire on an annual basis if we were to follow the current decarbonization plan. We can't really afford to waste any time, and this is precisely the reality for infrastructure carbon, which acquired half a page attention in our 200-page document. In fact, there was, a great sense of, a heavy reliance in some case, externalizing their responsibility onto the construction sector as well for innovation and carbon management strategy. In addition, despite the promise of these intense electrification, there is little evidence on how they plan to address the carbon consequence that cannot be depreciated over the life of these assets. I shared a slice of this exercise from my talk earlier this Tuesday, where we equated the whole life carbon of the road to the tailpipe emission of a car per kilometer, and this is what we came up with. So to decarbonize is not just about building great, big, expensive things that caters only to a privileged few, but that which can be implemented now and caters to the wider society. It's about finding the right balance of technological interventions and daring to urge social behavioral adaptations in the now. So I'm about to share an example of how detrimental overlooking infrastructure carbon can be using components of road transport infrastructure. This will kind of help us gauge the potential impacts of the various infrastructure schemes that have been approved or lined up conflicting with our net zero goals. So just to clarify, the 10 to 30% gap in reaching carbon neutrality that you saw there, that persists despite integrating resource efficient technology and a carbon neutral grid. Therefore, this makes it a huge concern. So in addition to welcoming the panelists and all the attendees as a Decarbonate member myself, I hope we can talk about how, net zero consistent revival of the existing scheme appraisal and approval procedures can be materialized, and from an economic perspective, how potentially to develop carbon budgets for schemes based on their capability to depreciate their embodied carbon. Again, these are recommendations for now until we have sustainable ways of abating this infrastructure carbon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Kadam, both for the novel use of video, which is excellent, and the kind of global perspective that you added to it with some of the supply chain issues, some of those decarbonisation options as well. That was great.
I had to play harder.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it worked very well. So thank you very much. Okay. So thanks to everybody for all the panelists for your opening remarks. That sets us up now for our discussion session for up to 50 minutes. And I've got some few questions in waiting to ask, but we're also very keen that we engage with the audience. So any of you, please feel free to post questions in the chat, and I will then pose those questions to our panelists. So while I await you doing that, I will ask the first one on my list of prepped ones, which is to Kim. What are your key tips for shifting to a whole life carbon approach?
Shifting to a whole life carbon approach is making it explicit. So I'm going to talk about the scope 3 supply chain, what we're doing in the infrastructure construction space is making it a requirement, making it explicit to do, but also making it easy for people. It's absolutely wonderful if somebody turns around and says, can we have the whole life carbon assessment of this? And not having the information that the data required to do that, and turning it into a full-scale cottage industry. The kind of technologies that we have out there, the digital technologies that we have out there, we can already do it. We are already doing it in the infrastructure space. And it doesn't always get feted because, again, we're working on projects, we're doing this behind the scenes. So it's all about making it easy, making it an explicit requirement. So I'm also going to mention the National Highways, which was Highways England, recently published their net zero roadmap. And a key part of that is whole life carbon assessment all the way through the project life cycle. So that's right from what we would term as stage 0, where you actually just have, is this project going ahead? Traditionally, we've always had for a road scheme, we've always looked for the carbon associated with the road users out to 60 years, and that forms part of the business case. And if this is going to have an adverse effect, it doesn't even get past from stage 0. And then actually looking at not just the road users, but the carbon associated with it all the way through the project life cycle, right the way until it gets out to construction. But it's also worth noting a highway scheme at any rate won't get permission to go anywhere unless it is shown to be actually improving traffic flow and making things better. The other thing to note is, yeah, that's becoming explicit. And again, it's early days because the data isn't always there. I don't know whether you've seen Is Our Carbon Wallet Empty, where we looked at the carbon associated with infrastructure for the pipeline, the forward pipeline, not just in the transport sector. And what you found was pockets across all the various sectors were measuring carbon to some extent, but could you get hold of the data? Was it in a consistent format? Whatever, certainly didn't look at whole life carbon. It only looked at the capital carbon associated with it. So we're getting there. The infrastructure clients are saying, look, we want to do this. They're setting out clear net zero targets and investing and making sure that it happens, but it's still very, very early days. So yeah, it's making it explicit, making it easy for people across the whole of the supply chain, and yeah, making sure that it's all the way through. Does that make any sense? Hopefully.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. If any of the panel have any further comments, please either put your hand up or unmute yourself, and I'll bring you in. Otherwise, I turn to Chris. In terms of supply chain, what needs to be done for the supply chain to be delivering whole life carbon assessments and reduction?
I think the really simple answer to this is to be asked to do it. And I say that, I'm proud to work at Skanska. I was at the Construction News Awards last night. We were up for a low carbon leader award, we didn't win it. But what I saw from all of the other entries was so much movement and progress in this decarbonisation space. There's so much going on out there, there's so much innovation coming through, there's people pushing hard in areas, but it's not everybody. So there is maybe 10%, 20% of the industry pushing hard to try and rise to this decarbonisation challenge. I think the rest are not unwilling to do so, maybe don't know quite where to start, maybe don't know where to invest, or there's lots of other things on their critical must-do list before they get down to carbon, just to keep their the businesses going where they want them to go. So I think if you then take the stick approach and start to ask for it, and ask for it in a consistent way, going back to Kim's point about good quality data that is readily accessible, can be used by the industry to drive improvements in the industry, start to measure apples with apples, and making sure that offer A is comparable with offer B if you're a client asking for carbon, then you will start to get even more traction. As I said in my opening 5 minutes, there's so much opportunity within current standards and within current material specifications if they're considered early enough in that whole design development route selection phase. And unfortunately, what happens is we tend to just look at what's built, and sometimes you might not see 80% of the carbon savings that have been achieved before you actually get on site. So a little bit of clarity, stretching the art of the possible within the current standards. We don't have to wait for new standards. There's so much we can do right now. Getting people to communicate in the same language, using the same metrics, to align that apples with apples, and just asking for it. I think if we ask for it, the supply chain will rise and deliver it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, that's a really challenging thing, I think, not just in infrastructure, is that if you do tackle carbon earlier, then as you say, effectively emissions never happen. And to be able to talk about that, a common thing is to want to say how much you saved by not doing something, which is itself then a bit fraught with issues of itself. What do you think about that? The issue of talking about what carbon has been avoided by making changes that never comes to pass.
I would say it's a really good challenge, and it amuses me because it's common. People are, oh, you saved something by not doing it, well, therefore it never existed in the first place, and therefore you never saved it. The argument and the conversations that I have in my business over the past 2 or 3 years to get us to this stage is carbon is an outcome. So as a business, we report to the market what our turnover is, what our revenue is, how we're performing, and it's all cost driven, because that's what the market demands, and that's what success looks like for a tier 1 contractor. Where we're getting to is cost and carbon as dual outcomes of activity. So that saving by not building kind of doesn't hold water when you're still achieving the outcomes that the client requires. So my outcomes are cost and carbon, but the client's outcome might be, I don't know, 200 students per year going through a classroom, or a hospital ward capable of X amount of beds, or reduce congestion on a junction, on a busy junction. As long as you achieve the outcome, and you can do it in a low carbon way by not doing something, but still get to that outcome, then I think it's a legitimate saving.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I suppose you, to some extent as well, if you focus on the outcome, that maybe means targets, what is an acceptable level of carbon, then it doesn't matter what it might have been, it's whether you reach what you're aiming for, I suppose, which is itself another topic, I suppose, the target setting.
It is a huge topic, and the target should be 0.
Yeah, yeah, well, exactly. Okay, so we're getting a few questions in on the chat, so I'm going to save the other pre-arranged ones for later and dive straight into the ones that are coming in live. So we've got a couple from Danny asking, how can we engage smaller firms in the supply chain who are perhaps less familiar of the terms and of whole life carbon approach? And again, I think this applies in quite a lot of different sectors, not just infrastructure. Once you get down to an area where the supply chain is lots and lots of smaller actors. So it's a very broadly relevant question. Any panelists want to take that? Kim?
I can go in there. So, I mean, certainly what we've found, and I think Chris can echo some of this, is that you have small contractors that do absolutely brilliant, simply because their small size allows them to be more agile. And I have to confess, I spend most of my time decarbonising highway schemes, so hence I get very, very excited by them. So, for example, road painting. There is a lovely small company out there that has invested, because they're passionate about it, in low carbon road painting. And because of their small size, they've been able to do that. And again, sharing that knowledge across the whole of the supply chain is key to that. And it's also a case of, yes, not everybody can sit there and do a whole life cycle assessment of their product or whatever they're doing, because they simply don't have the manpower or the money. But I think in terms of where we sit, I suppose in the tier ones, what we would be termed as the tier ones, we can do as much as we possibly can to support that and bring everybody on the journey with you. I don't know, Chris, did you want to say anything else on that? Because you're I suppose the other thing is that I'm on the design side, Chris is on the construction side, and we work very, very closely together to decarbonise. And that's our whole ethos and passion for what we do.
I'll add a little bit, Kim, but not too much, because you were so eloquent and accurate and correct as always. The sum has to be greater than the whole, right? And the principal contractor, I don't make concrete and I don't make road paint, but what we do with Mott and other designers is get to a solution that delivers the outcome of less congestion or whatever it is. And how we engage suppliers and how we encourage suppliers to bring that innovation forward and bring it together to have the maximum impact has to be part of how infrastructure is delivered now and in the future. We can't just buy what we've always bought. We need to encourage the good stuff to come out. We need to encourage the line painters to go and invest in their very, very niche bit of the infrastructure, but it's a part of the whole. And everybody that was doing something within that whole structure was decarbonising as well as those guys, then the problem will be solved. But we just need to keep driving it. We need to keep collaborating with our supply chain and encouraging them and working with them. I did a piece of work with Cambridge as well recently on a carbon reduction code, and the whole point of that code was to allow organisations that don't have the size and capacity to employ a carbon specialist, let alone an environmental specialist, to be able to understand what they can do to have a big impact on carbon in the sector, and just help them get on that journey. I'm fortunate, we're fortunate, we have teams of experts, but that's a small part of the industry.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think that understanding what the big hitters are is central to a whole life or life cycle approach. But as you say, not everybody has the capacity to spend the time doing it. So yeah, getting, I guess, the general messages about what's big out is a really key part. We've got a few more questions coming in on the chat. I'm going to link a couple of them together, I think. I'm going to go back to one here that was related to what something Kim was saying, I think two speaking points ago. A regular criticism of Highways Agency is that they are road builders and that's their entire mindset. Hearing you and the others on the panel speak, is it possible that contractors could be important agents in holding the Highways Agency to account and forcing them to stick to their own improving rhetoric about decarbonisation? If so, what leverage do contractors hold in such situations? And is there any evidence of this happening already? I suppose Kim, Chris, maybe Jamie.
So I suppose what we're seeing across the market, yeah, I have a client consultant relationship. It's exceedingly difficult for me to hold a client to account. But what you can do, and what we've been doing across the industry, is, okay, the client hasn't been specifying X, Y, and Z, but we've been trying to do it anyway. So when you went back to the infrastructure carbon review, that was industry-led rather than government-led, although it was published for the Treasury originally. But it was industry-led, and that's the same when we look at PAS 2080. It's industry-led about how we fill in the gaps and how we decarbonise as an industry. So yes, it's difficult to hold a client to account, but you can do it anyway. And actually, if you go back to the infrastructure carbon review again, very clear relationship between cost and carbon. Reduce your carbon, reduce your cost, and that means that you have the commercial imperatives there. And all of us, I love having a job, and I would like my company to keep going, please. And it has to be done from not just a saving decarbonisation perspective, it's also a cost perspective as well, and it makes you a viable, sustainable business going into the future. So again, can't hold the clients to account. That would be lovely. But we can all move on that journey. And again, from what I'm seeing across the whole of the piece, certainly in the UK, clients are moving in that direction anyway, and we're helping that. I think you'd agree with that, Jamie?
I would, yes. I was going to add, I guess, a perspective. I sit alongside what was Highways England, now National Highways, as I think they've been rebranded. Let's not get into how much that's cost. We're being held to account more and more, I guess, from a government perspective when it comes to carbon. So National Highways are one of the arm-length bodies under the Department for Transport, and ourselves, HS2 and East West Rail are working together on kind of whole life carbon requirements. So we will be following the same kind of principles, methodologies, the same requirements, which hopefully helps the likes of Kim and Chris and the roles that they're doing and the organisations that form the supply chain. So that we've got greater clarity, transparency, I guess, from a carbon perspective. So you will see over time more of our types of organisations being held to account. But in the same instance, it's great. We want the supply chain to challenge us, to be bringing solutions to the table that help us reduce our overall carbon emissions.
Thank you, Jamie. Oh, sorry. Yeah, carry on.
Chris, that, Stephen, a little bit.
Yeah, please do.
It's just to say, Jamie and Colin Home and others at National Highways don't sit in a box and kind of decide what's going on and how they're going to do things, although they have the ultimate decision as the customer. Both Kim and I and many others in the industry often get consulted. Our customers talk to us about what we think good might look like and how what they could improve as a customer in terms of how they procure, what they ask for, how we help them meet their customers' needs. So you talk about national highways and you talk about what they're delivering. You know, that carbon bit is just one bit of it. It's, you know, think about all the voices that are complaining about sitting in a traffic jam in rush hour, and you know, it's tackling those larger problems and only building what we actually need to build. But they, you know, we collaborate, we work as an industry, we support each other, we talk to each other, and none of us work in isolation. But we both, you know, we can all do more. We all try to do more. I think Jamie would agree that it's a collaborative piece, and none of us really work in silos on it.
Okay, thank you all. I think what some of you were saying just then relates, there's two or maybe even three questions in the chat. One of them has actually been sent only to me, but it relates to government role or legislation or so on. So I'll start with one and then I'll try and add them all in. The most recent question we had was, to what extent do the panelists believe that whole life cycle decarbonisation can be brought about through information and incentives, or does this need to be designed and orchestrated top down by government? So what kind of levers do we need, I suppose, or are most effective?
I'll go first if you want on that. I think it's both. So my experience across private and public sector is there's no single kind of silver bullet that gives you the answer. Clearly, we need the government to be setting direction and expectations, particularly if you're a public sector organisation, as to what we need to do to decarbonise. But it can't come just top down, because for example, we've got 40,000 employees. If there's only 6, 7, 8 people at the top level saying we need to do it, and the other 39,990 aren't doing much about it, probably not an awful lot's going to change, to be honest. So you need to be kind of meeting in the middle somewhere, where you've got that top down direction from government requirements, legislation, kind of company direction, as well as the kind of bottom up piece, people coming with innovative solutions to the table, kind of educating and developing the competency basically of everybody when it comes to carbon, in a similar way, I guess, to cost. You know, cost is at the forefront of most people's minds when they're working on a project, and that's kind of what we need to do with carbon as well. So for me, it's a bit of both, top down and bottom up approach, and hopefully you'll get a good outcome.
Thank you, Jamie. Any other comments from any other panelists?
May I add to that, Stephen, if that's okay?
Sure.
The one aspect that needs to focus, I completely agree with Jamie, it has to happen at both the ends for it to catch fire. But the one thing that also strongly influences infrastructure carbon is the way the end users utilize the infrastructure that is provided to them. The whole industry sort of operates on a feedback loop, because when there is more demand, more infrastructure is built, and then the demand increases, and then there's more building that's required. So I believe, you know, in response to Jamie's in response to Jamie's point, Welsh government recently they froze all their the road schemes that they had planned for future development. And they are currently appraising them in the current context of global pandemic, how the road traffic levels have gone down recently. And they are doing this with a view to reach their intermittent target for 2030. So we want to see this level of commitment coming from our national authorities, regional, local authorities as well, because that's how the authority trickles down from top down. At the same time, I believe there is some level of initiative we need to see from people as well. There has to be, I mean, as I mentioned, the balance of societal adaptation and tech uptake has to be established. It has to be at least in the range of 60 to 40. We need to adapt more for the government to sort of dare and intervene, providing incentives, or when it comes to rewriting policies to accommodate the infrastructure emissions being mitigated over time. So these are my responses as well.
Thank you, Kadam. Okay, I'm going to, staying on the top-down aspect, I've got two related questions, one broader and one more specific. So there was an earlier question on whether we need legislation. So in terms of a top-down approach then, and the policy options available to a government, specifically on legislation, do we need legislation to enforce whole life carbon measurement and reduction, and what might this look like? Also, I'll combine that with another policy related question, which was what change do the panel see from procurement policy note 0621, taking account of carbon reduction plans in the procurement of major government contracts, which is coming in at the end of September. So related, a sort of general question on the role of legislation, and then specifically a procurement policy note.
I mean, if I may start, I am no expert in legislative perspectives, but I believe that the best way to go about addressing, I mean, as I mentioned, it must transform from being a more, a nuanced aspect, this whole life carbon accounting. It has to become a kind of a default setting in appraisal and approval procedures in general. I mean, I've had the opportunity to go through what we have. I'm sure the rest of the panelists will be aware of this, but something called the POP, or post-operational project evaluation reports, that are generally produced after the first and the fifth year of completion of a scheme to evaluate how they have performed economically and environmentally. And even according to an argument by Peter Jones from UCL, one of his panels yesterday, all of these scheme evaluations account for model assessment, but not necessarily carbon assessment. So it's not just, us within this panel or people who are critically thinking about this issue right now, but it has been felt by a number of those who are, keen for us to reach net zero by 2050. So I completely back the fact that some level of top-down guidance / standards / legislative changes have to happen in this area. Thank you.
Can I just add to that in terms of we in the UK now have that legislative change, which is net zero in 2019. If you think about the POPs, post whatever it is, evaluation, they have been in place prior to that. And what we're seeing again across the industry is that everyone is responding to it. We don't have thou shalt reduce your carbon by X, Y, and Z. We're all aiming for that net zero journey. We're all trying to get to that net zero journey. Also, what we're seeing in terms of procurement, and I do know what you're talking about, whoever posted that, is that again, it's putting it into procurement, making it explicit, as Chris said, that at the moment it's requiring all companies who want to bid on infrastructure projects, large projects, to have a net zero plan, how they're going to get to net zero. Also looking at our scope 3 emissions. It's not measured yet, but that will come into the future, and that's come down from the Cabinet Office. So all these things are in train, but you've got that, I suppose, that landslide effect of 2019. We're in a net zero world, and both industry and the government and the various organisations are responding to that.
2019,
Kim? 2019, May 2019. Right. So prior to that, that's when all the POPs came in. Yeah. If you look at Department for Transport, again, I'm a little bit, this is a transport call, so I can be. Department for Transport, all of its guidance, etc., was prior to 2019. That guidance, that assessment criteria is all being rapidly updated. And certainly those of us who were working towards a net zero world were sitting there in the absence of any guidance or anything there. And again, as I say, I'm pretty old, got the grey. 2008, when the Climate Change Act came into place, there was a lot of effort, and we had been thinking in a low carbon world prior to that, in post 2008. So we've been setting the basis for it, but what has happened with that one piece of legislation in the UK has massively accelerated what we're doing within the infrastructure sector and within the transportation sector. I have never seen it like this, and I've been sitting there doing carbon for years. I've never seen so much passion and will to do something across the whole of the industry.
Yes, sorry, I was getting confused there, Kim. I think you're referring to the national overall net zero for 2019, and I thought you were talking about specifically. I guess, so I'd like to add a follow-up then. The risk, well, a major positive of net zero becoming a target rather than 80% reduction is, I think it somewhat reduces the possibility that any particular sector can go, well, we'll be part of the 20% that's left after we've reduced 80%, which was the original Climate Change Act. If it's net zero as a whole, it's as clear a story, although still, I imagine there must be going on within the concept of net zero is some emissions, some absorption. So there's still scope for some sectors to say, we can't go that far. So is there an issue between, this relates to, I think it was Jamie mentioned science-based targets earlier on, but science-based targets is a concept that many on this call may know, but the idea, one of the common approaches is called the sectoral decarbonisation approach. And effectively you're trying to translate a national or even global carbon target down to sectoral targets. But there's still this issue of, I would imagine there's still an issue of some sectors not going as far. So, but it sounds like you're perceiving the effect of the national net zero legislation, the Climate Change Act update in 2019, as having a significant effect within infrastructure.
I can wholeheartedly say that because I literally moved from Australia back into the UK just as this legislation was coming through. Now, in Australia, nobody really cared, and they were opening Adani at the same time. But I literally came back. The first event that I went to was Skanska announcing its net zero targets in the UK for 2045. And it's basically been on a roller coaster all the way through. The pull by clients, by government. I have never met anybody in this industry who wanted on purpose to do the wrong thing and to do something that is going to kill the planet. And yeah, the step change is amazing, absolutely amazing within the industry, and more people are gathering momentum, and I'm seeing a paradigm shift. I literally have been here for so long, I've never seen anything like it.
Okay, thank you. Well, that sounds very positive. No, that's excellent. Anybody else with a comment? Yeah, Chris, I can see.
Stephen, if I may, so just to follow on some of that, you know, the targets and the net zero there. I think the CCC carbon budgets help. Just, you know, who's in that 20% and who isn't. You know, where we should be pushing and what the UK economy needs to push helps give a little bit of definition there. I think what we don't see, and probably what we need to see more of, and I see Jamie's got his hand up and we'll hopefully be able to follow this as well, is where to prioritise. So, you know, we can't sit around and wait for 2050 or 2045. You know, every ton of carbon we're producing now is probably worth 30 tons of carbon in 2030. It's you know, what are the not easy wins, but what are the big wins that we should be tackling first and prioritising our investment in decarbonisation in order to have that big impact going forward. And it's data-led, it has to be data-led.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, Jamie.
Chris threw me slightly in terms of the point I was going to make. I'll come back to that, but yeah, just in response, I completely agree with what Chris has just said. We've basically boiled down, I guess, what we're doing Network Rail into three kind of key areas, covering your scope 1, your scope 2 and scope 3, which is really focusing on the need to move from diesel to electric for the power source for the whole UK and where we can electrify, then providing that power from renewable sources directly, And then the third element being kind of whole life carbon and making sure that we're considering carbon in everything that we do as the infrastructure organisation. And it wasn't me actually that mentioned science-based targets earlier, but I should point out that we are, so thank you for the plug, the first railway organisation in the world to set science-based targets that align with only 1.5 degrees of warming. So we've laid out our stall and we're highly committed to it. But just coming back to the regulatory perspective, clearly, if we're left to our own devices, we don't do things correctly, kind of as society, and that's not just from an environment perspective. So we do need some kind of regulatory direction. Clearly, as Kim's alluded to, we've got that as the UK at the kind of high level. But the one thing we need to bear in mind, I suppose, is regulations don't always drive the right kind of outcomes, and they can bring in too much red tape, coming back to the kind of smaller organisations where a lot of the innovation can come from. I was in the auto industry at the time of the Volkswagen scandal, and that was an outcome of the kind of wrong legislation, in my opinion, and people trying to find ways to kind of beat the system. Basically, so you've got to be careful that sometimes, you know, the old adage that legislation is an ass, if you like. We've got to make sure it's the right legislation, if you like, to drive the right change and behaviour across society, not just within any one industry.
Thanks, Jamie. Okay, I'm going to go back to the chat, and there's a further question here that I haven't got asked yet, which is, we heard in the first day keynote that we need overall reductions in miles travelled, but the transport infrastructure sector still seems focused on more travel, more speed, more capacity. How do we resolve this conflict?
Would you like me?
Shall I go?
Go for it.
Yeah, go ahead. Who's on the mic? Jamie, I think.
It's a fair point. You're absolutely right, I suppose. Road builders want to build roads, railway operators want to run rail. I think from my response to that, I guess, was we've got to be more intelligent about the way we move people and goods, basically. So as a rail operator, we've seen obviously a significant reduction during lockdown in terms of the number of passengers using the network. That in turn has freed up some capacity to allow us to move more freight across the network, which means that we've actually helped the country reduce emissions because you've got them off, some of that freight off higher emitting kind of sources of transport. So I think for me, it's got to be clearly, you know, we're not going to remove the need completely for people and stuff to move around the country. We've just got to be more intelligent about it within a kind of carbon constrained world, basically. So, you know, the infrastructure that we've got, we don't really want it lying to waste, I suppose. The money that's been invested, the carbon that's embodied in it, the railway network itself is still pretty much what the Victorians engineered for us, with a few additions over time. But how can we make that as efficient and low carbon as possible in moving people and freight around would be my my initial response to that. But I'll let Kim go now. Sorry, Kim.
You can tell this is my favourite subject, can't you? I mean, for me, it's all about that transport solution. And I think what I'm saying is actually we're getting more into that mindset of what is the right solution, what is the outcome that we want, and that's referring back to Chris. So it's that transport solution, but it's also doing more with what we already have. Yes, I fully confess that way back in 2010, carbon infrastructure, embodied carbon within that, it did not form part of the agenda at all, or the decision process. But also what we've got to be aware of is we don't want the whole transport network to shut down because of the embodied carbon. We need to maintain it where there is an issue and we need an outcome. We've got to look at that overall transport solution in terms of freight or whatever. But there's also the other thing, is that the only reason we have lots of transport solutions, etc., is the people. And it's based on demand. If people want to reduce their carbon footprint, they have the choice. They don't have to be traveling here, there and everywhere if they don't want to. So you have a choice. So it's, I suppose it's going back to what I originally said, was we're not looking at anything in isolation anymore. We're not looking at a road scheme in isolation. We're not looking at a rail scheme in isolation. We're looking at that overall system about how we get people from A to B and how we encourage people to use low carbon transport, whether that be rail, whether that be electric vehicles, hydrogen, or whatever. But the only reason infrastructure exists is for people.
Anyone else on the panel have a comment? Oh, Kadam, sorry. Yeah.
I completely agree. I mean, both Jamie and Kim addressed whatever I wanted to suggest as to the fact that, I mean, from science perspective, CCC does recommend that we reduce travel demand by at least about 21 to 24% if we want to reach net zero. It's a part of the balanced net zero pathway. So it is recommended, something that cannot be overlooked. However, I do agree with Kim that, you know, it will be pointless to stop any building from now on. Instead, what we would love to see is a reallocation of resources, reallocation of, you know, innovation and investments into public transport, for example, more into rail, making, you know, I mean, this sort of treads into, you know, the areas of public franchising or shared mobility or integrated mobility. But if the building from just road expansion can be, you know, relocated to improving public transport infrastructure or active transport infrastructure, it'll be a great way to, you know, balance it out to, while we are catering to, you know, the growing travel demand, we are also reducing infrastructure related impacts. That's my response, and I'm completely in agreement with Jamie and Kim on this.
Thank you, Kadam. And I can see Chris has his hand up.
Thanks, Stephen. I think one thing that the pandemic has shown us is that you don't have to be present to be productive. This is the first time I've been in an office for a very long time, and it's because I had 3 or 4 things in London that I wanted to do, so I've come down to London for the day. Pre-pandemic, I might have been here 3 or 4 days a week, and what we saw to our bottom line is massive savings as a business. So unless you're physically carrying out construction works, you don't need to be at that construction site. So, you know, we're not far, and when I say this in relevance to the 2008 piece of legislation changes over decades, I don't think we're far away from transport being a leisure choice rather than a job necessity, unless you're, I don't know, Amazon or DHL or somebody that's going to get my whatever it is, CD, that's sort of my age, to my house on that set day. You know, I think, in my personal opinion, this 27 billion of investment that has been announced in infrastructure transport, I think is probably the last hurrah in major transport links. I think hopefully we'll look at the pandemic and we'll start to see a drop in demand. But at the same time, you've got to balance that with a population that is still growing and demand that is still growing.
Thank you, Chris. There's a comment, I think all of you can see, but there's a comment just picking up and debating whether we have a choice or not, which I think you can all read, but we tend to project, the comment ends, we tend to project our own personal privileged position of having some choice on the whole population as if their context has the same degree of choice. I suppose, I guess the point is how much choice do we have? It does vary undoubtedly across the population, and there is, my own perspective on it is that there's a balance between, there is consumer demand, there is demand. Within that, there's a variation in choice among the population. There are also vested interests in organisations whose business model is to build infrastructure. So it's a very difficult debate to have, I would say. I think Kadam's reference to the Committee on Climate Change is useful there. I mean, it's one set of scenarios produced under one model, the Times model, I believe, a kind of at least cost optimization model. So it's one story of how we get to net zero. And that story suggests we need to reduce miles traveled. But nevertheless, there's this tension of needing new infrastructure. And as Chris said, I think the pandemic, one thing about the pandemic is demonstrating how, I suppose, if organizations support home working, that's also a case. Does an employee have a choice on where they work? So it's a difficult topic. If any of you have a further, panelists have a further comment on that, please do. Otherwise, I think I'll go to the pre-prepared questions. Oh, Kim,
I was
go
just
ahead.
going to apologise. Yes, I did oversimplify it, and yeah, more than aware. And I suppose one of the things that has always been niggling me in the back of my head is that, yeah, I'm in an exceedingly lucky position where I can make a choice. But I'm very aware that as we're all focusing on climate change, decarbonisation, what impact that is going to have on people who don't have a choice, and especially in terms of, you know, if you're driving a van, if you're driving whatever, and it's part of your livelihood. I mean, not everybody can buy an EV car. Not everyone can afford to actually decarbonise. So yeah, I apologise fully for making sweeping statements, and you're right. It is incredibly complex.
Thank you, Kim. An additional question, I suppose, that I was thinking, there's been a lot of positivity during the panel discussion today, and I would say personally, an observation compared to, say, 10 years ago, is that different organizations that are different parts of the infrastructure sector as a whole, there's much more collaboration and talking of how you can work together in a way that I didn't perceive, say, 10 years ago, where it was more, well, we're doing this, but it needs that organization over there to engage. So that, I feel, is a very positive development, and thinking of what Kim was saying, no doubt helped a lot by the net zero legislation nationally. At the same time, this updates the infrastructure carbon review that I mentioned that was published earlier in the year is showing transport sector increasing. Now I doubt the data is there since 2019. So it's the story up to when Kim was saying perceived a big change. But I guess the point is we're still seeing this general increase, at least so far, up to a couple of years ago is probably where the data last was. So my question to the panel then is, what do you think the major challenges are now to reducing carbon? Maybe too broad a question. Kim, you're muted.
Okay, so I suppose what is happening is that we've got a lot of legacy there. Again, if you work in the transport sector, purely infrastructure, is that some schemes we've been working on literally for 30 years, and they were first conceived 30 years ago, and they're still sort of trundling on. Again, when they come back into when they're reevaluated, now carbon is being considered part and parcel of it. But I would say that that is one of the issues. Plus, we all want to do the right thing, but we don't necessarily have it all the way through a project life cycle. And although we're trying to collaborate, we're not always in a position where we can. A good example is when Chris and I work together on a scheme, we won't get it until you get right down the bottom, until you're into detailed design. And by then, the hard-hitting carbon reductions have already been made. So it does get harder. But again, it's all work in progress. We're all on this journey.
I think, Kim, just to add to that, we are kind of seeing a lag, I think, which is why the numbers are up. But it goes back to the point that I made in the 5-minute introduction of, we may need to invest in carbon to get to net zero carbon. If you move away from the infrastructure sector and move into the energy generation sector, how many millions of tons of concrete are going to go through the power station that will deliver near zero carbon electricity to the market to power the trains and the EV vehicles? We have to make that investment in infrastructure now in order to get to a net zero position. And I think, you know, we will see a rise before we see a fall. I think that's inevitable.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very good point. I've got, there's two more questions coming in the chat, unless Kadam or Jamie want to come in on the last one. So one is saying, it was very interesting, Chris, to describe the infrastructure boon as a last hurrah. What does this mean for the construction business? Do the businesses of the panel actively talk about how they might need to shift focus to be future-proofed in a reduced travel demand world? And this again has analogies in most sectors. Well, certainly the more carbon intensive sectors is what are they thinking about for the future? But yeah, within your own businesses.
Just to answer, well, it was my point. I think it is a last hurrah from the basis of, in a couple of decades, those policies are going to kick in, I expect. And I do expect we'll get to a point where the majority of transport users will be leisure rather than business. I think, you know, we've seen it with the pandemic, and we've seen the investment in technology and the technology infrastructure that enables people to work from home or be productive in other ways than being present. So I do think that although there's a capacity demand and growth still, that in a couple of decades that will start to peter off, and I think we'll have enough infrastructure with the right policies for that active travel or last mile elements coming in. But what's happening for my business? I don't know. I'll be retired in 20 years. I work for quite a diverse business. Skanska don't just build infrastructure. You know, we also maintain infrastructure. We do an awful lot of work with Network Rail to maintain North West and Central, and you know, refurbish stations. We build houses, we build schools, we build hospitals. There will always be a need for something, for homes for people to live in, for schools for children to go to. The capital infrastructure part of our business is just part of our business. So I think we're diverse enough to survive if the last hurrah actually is the last hurrah in 20 years' time.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else have any comments on that? I suppose the general point is changing a skill base in a business to respond to achieving net zero carbon.
Yeah, I'll jump in if that's okay. I think COVID inadvertently is kind of teaching us some things, or certainly items that we can learn about being more kind of flexible and adaptable as an organisation. I mentioned earlier the fact that we've seen a significant reduction in passenger numbers across the network. So it's kind of highlighting the need to have a more flexible kind of timetabling system. You don't necessarily have the same number of people moving up and down the network at the same time as we historically had. Will we see that go back to the way it was? I don't think we will, because of the ability for more flexible working, the fact that people have got used to kind of working from home and maybe not travelling into the same work location every day. The fact that we can potentially get more kind of freight onto the network, so the modal shift side of things, but also the fact we need technology to support a more flexible network, if you like, get trains running closer together, maybe shorter trains, allowing more trains onto the network in that sense, but also the kind of skill set, I guess. And I think as an infrastructure company, we will see more and more maintaining, enhancing and renewing of items rather than necessarily major kind of new construction projects, if you like. So I would expect we'll see more smaller projects and fewer big projects, I guess, which aligns with kind of Chris's comments in that sense. But also the skill set, you know, we need to upskill across our board, across our, not just the board, across the company. And we've been doing a lot of work on the kind of competency framework that different roles need to have in a more decarbonised world. And actually, when I started my career, I kind of thought there's not that many people need to be doing stuff from an environment and decarb perspective. Now it's very difficult to identify any one function within the business that doesn't have to have carbon right up the top of their agenda, if you like, and people who are kind of skilled in being able to drive change within their part of the organisation from a carbon perspective.
Thank you, Jamie. Unless Kim or Kadam have any further comments. Kadam, it looks like you've unmuted.
Yes, please. To add to Jamie's point on demand, as you mentioned, Jamie, it may look bleak at the moment in terms of travel demand by rail or even buses for that matter. I believe these are basically residual effects of COVID lingering, but we will have to eventually come off of this. I would give no more than 5-6 years from now, when people will start going back to the pre-pandemic levels of traveling using public transport. I understand that the infrastructure has to keep up to be able to cater to that demand. So that's where your input in terms of green recovery, catering to that demand is required. As researchers, I believe our contribution here will be really to, make available that repository of evidence for the local decision makers, for the companies the panelists are from at the moment, even for the national decision makers, to make carbon conscious, net zero consistent decisions from. I mean, Kim did mention about, there's this general thirst among us life cycle analysts for data, and that's precisely what's lacking at the moment. I think what we can do at the moment is make use of whatever resources there are available. And a huge building block really is the ICE database that the University of Bath has given to us all in this area. I think it's important to churn out as much data and put it out there so the transport stakeholders can do what they do best. In terms of the trajectory, via the electrification route or the hydrogen route, I have a very simple example. I'm looking to get an Xbox Series X for my son, and I'm struggling to get hold of it. It has been out of stock for almost a year now. And when you delve into the reason, it's because of the lack of those critical materials we need for the circuit board. This is pretty much, sort of in line with what Kate Pangborn, one of our attendees, who shared with us about the waiting times for electric bikes these days. If you place an order for it, we are likely to reach this level of, a demand when it comes to electric vehicles as well, or even worse for that matter, because I personally know at least 4 people who have inquired about what electric vehicles are performing like because of my involvement in transport. So I think we need to think about, investing in public transport infrastructure more. We can't think of rail and road as 2 silos sector. They have to come together. How we can integrate mobility between these different modes is something. It's a crucial step in our, step forward. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kadam. Okay, thanks very much to everyone on the panel and to all the attendees for pitching in and getting involved, asking questions and interacting with us. That's been really, really good. As a kind of closing observation, there is this impression of a lot of activity, and particularly from the 2019 net zero kind of update to the Climate Change Act, which come across very positively to me personally. So I just like to close by thanking the panel very much. We'll now have